During a joyful Christmas celebration, single father Marco and Clara share a warm moment, laughter filling the air as they bond over their shared losses. But just as they begin to feel like a family, Marco's young daughter, Alina, bursts into the room, her face twisted with fear, shouting, "She doesn't belong here." Her small hands clutched something that shocked everyone, leaving Clara and Marco questioning what this means for their future. Hi there. I'm Goldie, and welcome to Goldie's Love Stories. Marco hadn't expected to be a single father at 38, but life had its way of pulling the rug out from under him. His divorce from Valentina was still fresh, though the paperwork had been signed months ago. He had tried to keep things amicable for the sake of their daughter, Alina, but the wounds ran deeper than either of them would ever admit. The once promising marriage had slowly deteriorated, and now, all that remained were the remnants of shared memories and the challenge of co-parenting. He and Alina had found a new rhythm, though it wasn't easy. At just 8 years old, she was struggling with the concept of her parents not being together anymore. Marco tried his best to create stability for her, though there was always the lingering tension of how to fill the void left by Valentina. Marco's own loneliness crept in during the quiet moments, after Alina had gone to bed and the house felt too big for just the two of them. One evening, a chance encounter at the grocery store changed the trajectory of Marco's life. He had been standing in the produce section, deliberating over which tomatoes to buy when he noticed Clara, a woman who seemed equally indecisive. They exchanged small talk, bonded over their mutual inability to pick a ripe tomato, and before long, they were laughing at the absurdity of it all. It was a light-hearted moment in the midst of a mundane task, but it sparked something in Marco that had been dormant for far too long. Clara was different from Valentina in almost every way. Where Valentina had been sharp and demanding, Clara was soft-spoken and easygoing. Their budding friendship quickly turned into something more, and Marco found himself drawn to her warmth. Alina, however, was a different story. It wasn't that Alina disliked Clara. At first, she seemed to accept her father's new friend, likely seeing her as someone who would come and go like many others who had briefly entered Marco's life. But as Clara became a more constant presence, Alina began to pull away. The once bubbly child became quieter, more reserved. She didn't say much when Clara was around, but Marco could see it in her eyes. There was a growing discomfort. One weekend, Marco invited Clara over for dinner. It was the first time they had all sat down together as a family unit, and while Marco tried to create a light atmosphere, the tension was palpable. Alina barely touched her food and excused herself early, retreating to her room with little more than a mumbled goodnight. After Clara left that evening, Marco knocked on Alina's door. She didn't answer at first, but when he entered, he found her sitting on her bed, clutching the stuffed bear she'd had since she was a toddler. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her lip trembling as she spoke softly. "Do you still love Mommy?" The question hit Marco like a punch to the gut. He knelt beside her bed, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Of course I do," he said carefully. "But Mommy and I aren't together anymore. That doesn't mean I've stopped caring about her." Alina was silent for a long time before she finally whispered, "Why is Clara here then?" That conversation lingered in Marco's mind for days. He had known that dating again would be a challenge, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply it would affect Alina. He spent the next few days reflecting on his choices, wondering if he was moving too quickly or if he was being selfish by bringing Clara into their lives. Alina's subtle withdrawal from both him and Clara weighed heavily on him, and for the first time since the divorce, Marco began to doubt whether he was truly ready to move on. Clara noticed the change in him. She was perceptive, and though she didn't push, Marco could see the unspoken questions in her eyes. They had shared enough about their pasts for her to understand his hesitation. She too had experienced loss. Her husband had passed away several years ago, and they had bonded over that shared experience. But now, as Marco wrestled with his second thoughts, he wondered if his baggage was too much for either of them to handle. A few days later, Marco and Clara met for coffee. The usually easy conversation between them felt stilted, weighed down by the elephant in the room. Clara was the first to break the silence. "Is Alina okay with this?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. Marco sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's struggling. I think she's having a hard time understanding why I'm with someone new." Clara nodded, her face softening with understanding. "I don't want to be the reason she's upset, Marco. If this isn't the right time, No, it's not that, Marco interrupted, reaching across the table to take her hand. It's just complicated. I want you in my life, Clara. But I also need to make sure Alina is okay. Clara squeezed his hand, her expression kind. I get it. I really do. We'll take it slow. Christmas was fast approaching, and Marco decided to invite Clara to their family celebration. It was a big step, one that both excited and terrified him. He wanted Clara to be part of their lives, but he knew that Alina's feelings would be the true test. As the holiday preparations began, Alina seemed to retreat further into herself. She helped decorate the tree, but her usual excitement for the holiday was noticeably absent. She would glance at the growing pile of presents with a solemn expression, and Marco couldn't shake the feeling that something was building beneath the surface. On Christmas Eve, Clara arrived at their home, carrying gifts and a hopeful smile. Marco greeted her warmly, but Alina barely acknowledged her presence. The three of them sat together in the living room, trying to enjoy the festivities, but the tension was undeniable. The morning of Christmas Day came with a quiet unease. Marco woke early to prepare breakfast, hoping the smell of pancakes and bacon would fill the house with a sense of normalcy. Clara stayed overnight, sleeping in the guest room, but the air was thick with tension. Marco tried to shake it off, focusing on the positive. This was the first Christmas in a long time where he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. He had someone by his side, and maybe, just maybe, things would work out. Clara joined him in the kitchen, her usual bright smile a bit more subdued. She could feel it too, Alina's quiet resistance. But they didn't talk about it, instead exchanging pleasantries as they set the table and brewed coffee. There was an unspoken agreement between them that today would be about making things work, even if it meant walking on eggshells. Alina emerged from her room, her eyes puffy from what Marco suspected was a night spent crying. She greeted them with a polite, if not cold, Merry Christmas, before sitting at the table, picking at her breakfast without enthusiasm. Marco's heart ached, torn between his love for his daughter and his desire to move on with his life. Clara, sensing the tension, kept her distance, trying not to impose too much on Alina's already fragile mood. The day progressed slowly. They opened presents in the living room, Alina unwrapping her gifts with minimal excitement. Marco had hoped that the holiday cheer would bring out her usual joy, but it became clear that the growing distance between them wasn't something a few presents could fix. Clara, ever the optimist, tried to engage Alina in conversation, complimenting her on the new art set Marco had gifted her. Maybe we can paint something together later, Clara offered, her tone light and hopeful. Alina barely looked up, mumbling, maybe, before quickly turning her attention to her next gift. The tension mounted, each interaction more strained than the last. Marco was at a loss. His worst fear was that Clara and Alina would never be able to coexist in his life, and it was becoming harder to ignore the reality of that fear. As the day wore on, small moments of awkwardness grew into palpable discomfort. Clara's presence, once a source of warmth for Marco, now seemed like an unwelcome intrusion to Alina. Every smile Clara gave Alina was met with a blank stare or a mumbled response, and Marco could see Clara's confidence faltering. It was clear that Alina felt threatened by Clara's presence, but Marco didn't know how to bridge the widening gap between them. After lunch, Marco decided to take Clara aside for a moment, hoping to check in and reassure her. They stepped out onto the back porch, the winter air biting at their skin. Clara crossed her arms, rubbing her hands together for warmth. I don't think she likes me, Clara said quietly, glancing at the windows where Alina could be seen sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. Marco sighed, leaning against the railing. It's not that she doesn't like you. She's just having a hard time. This is all new for her. For both of us. Clara's expression softened, but there was a hint of doubt in her eyes. I know it's hard for her, but I don't want to make things worse. Maybe I should. Don't, Marco interrupted, his voice firmer than he intended. Please don't. I need you here. We can make this work. Alina just needs time. Clara nodded, though the uncertainty lingered in her expression. I don't want to come between you two, Marco. She's your daughter. She should come first. You're not coming between us, Marco insisted, though deep down, he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. We'll figure it out. I promise. But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. Was he being selfish, pushing Clara and Alina together before either of them was ready? Later that afternoon, as they sat around the living room, Alina's best friend, Sophia, arrived with her parents for a short visit. Sophia, who was a few years older than Alina, had always been close to her, and Marco hoped that her presence might lift Alina's spirits. The two girls retreated to Alina's room, leaving the adults to chat in the living room. As the conversation flowed between Marco, Clara, and Sophia's parents, Sophia's voice could be heard from down the hall, chattering away with Alina. The sound of children playing should have been a comfort, but something felt off. Then, out of nowhere, Sophia's voice carried through the house, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you think your dad will marry Clara?" The room fell silent. Marco's heart skipped a beat, and he exchanged a panicked glance with Clara. Alina didn't respond right away, but the damage had already been done. The casual remark had struck a nerve. A few minutes later, Alina re-emerged from her room, her face pale and her demeanor colder than before. She didn't say anything, but the atmosphere in the house shifted dramatically. Marco knew then that something had changed, that Alina's discomfort had transformed into something much deeper. As the sun began to set, signaling the end of Christmas Day, Alina's behavior grew increasingly withdrawn. She barely spoke during dinner, avoiding eye contact with both Marco and Clara. The question from earlier, about Clara becoming her new mom, seemed to hang in the air, poisoning the mood. Clara tried to break the tension, suggesting they play a game or watch a movie, but Alina was having none of it. Then, as they were settling in for the evening, the disaster struck. They were sitting together in the living room, the Christmas tree lights twinkling softly, when Alina suddenly stood up, her small face twisted with fear and anger. Without warning, she burst into tears, her voice trembling as she shouted, "She doesn't belong here." Marco and Clara froze, stunned by the outburst. Alina's hands were clutching something tightly. Marco couldn't see what it was at first, but the intensity of her grip was alarming. Tears streamed down her face as she repeated the words, her voice growing louder, more desperate. "She doesn't belong here." Alina shouted again, her voice breaking as she held up the object in her hands, a photograph of Valentina, Marco's ex-wife. The room seemed to close in around them. Marco felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Clara's eyes widened, her face paling as she realized the depth of Alina's pain. The photo of Valentina, worn at the edges from years of handling, seemed to symbolize everything Alina had been holding inside. Marco stood, his heart pounding in his chest. "Alina, sweetheart, please." But Alina wasn't listening. She was sobbing now, clutching the photograph to her chest as if it were a lifeline. "She's not my mom. I don't want her here. I want mommy back." Marco's heart shattered into a million pieces. He had known Alina was struggling, but he hadn't realized just how much she had been holding inside. The photograph, the outburst, it was all too much. He looked at Clara, whose eyes were filled with pain and uncertainty. This was the disaster he had feared, the breaking point he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Clara, for her part, stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She had never wanted to replace Valentina, never wanted to make Alina feel like her mother's memory didn't matter. But in this moment, it was clear that Alina saw her as a threat, a usurper in the life she once knew. Marco knelt in front of Alina, gently reaching for her, but she pulled away, her sobs shaking her small frame. "I miss mommy," she whispered, her voice filled with a sadness that broke Marco's heart all over again. "I know, baby," Marco said softly, his own voice thick with emotion. "I miss her too. But things are different now. That doesn't mean we forget her. She's always going to be a part of our lives." Alina shook her head, still clutching the photograph. "But I don't want her to go away. I don't want Clara to take her place." Tears welled in Marco's eyes as he gently placed a hand on Alina's shoulder. "Clara isn't here to replace your mom. No one can ever replace her. But Clara, she's someone I care about. And I hope that one day, you'll be able to care about her too." Clara, standing nearby, felt a lump form in her throat. She had never wanted to be seen as a replacement for Valentina, but in that moment, she realized just how much Alina was struggling with the idea of her presence in their lives. As Marco comforted Alina, Clara felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She loved Marco, but she also knew that Alina's feelings came first. The emotional stakes were higher than ever, and the path forward was anything but clear. 2 years had passed since that tense Christmas, and life had transformed in ways Marco hadn't imagined. The once fragile bond between Clara and Alina had blossomed into something genuine, something steady. The house felt alive with warmth, and the weight of those early days had melted away as time worked its quiet magic. The winter snow had just begun to fall, dusting the world outside in a light blanket of white. Inside, the house buzzed with holiday preparations. Clara hummed softly to herself in the kitchen, checking on a batch of gingerbread cookies, while Marco was helping Alina hang the last few ornaments on the Christmas tree. This had become their little tradition, the three of them together, decorating their home and celebrating the season without the lingering tension that had once plagued them. Alina, now 11 years old, had changed so much in the past 2 years. The uncertainty and fear that had once clouded her feelings toward Clara had given way to something more profound, a sense of trust and belonging. She had accepted Clara into her life not just as someone who made her father happy, but as someone she, too, had grown to love in her own way. "Dad, can you help me with the star?" Alina called from her spot near the tree, holding up the golden ornament with a wide smile. Marco smiled, feeling a swell of pride as he joined her. "Let's do it together." As they placed the star on top, Clara appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She watched them for a moment, her heart full. Seeing Marco and Alina together like this never failed to bring her joy. The three of them had come so far since that first Christmas when everything felt uncertain. Clara walked over, wrapping her arms around Marco from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Everything looks beautiful," she murmured, her eyes taking in the glowing tree and the festive decorations they had worked on together. "It does," Marco agreed, placing his hand over hers. "This is the best Christmas yet." Alina stepped back, admiring the tree, and then turned to Clara with a soft smile. "Clara, I was thinking, maybe after we finish the cookies, we could do something special." Clara raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you have in mind?" Alina glanced at Marco before answering, her voice tentative but sincere. "I was hoping, maybe you could teach me how to make that pasta dish you always make for Dad? The one with the creamy sauce." Clara's eyes lit up with surprise and happiness. Alina had never asked to learn one of her recipes before, and it felt like a significant moment. "I'd love that, Alina," she said, her voice warm. "We can make it together." Marco watched the exchange, his chest tight with emotion. It wasn't just the fact that Alina was asking for Clara's recipe, it was the way she had grown comfortable enough to seek out moments like these, moments that solidified the bond they now shared. It was no longer a question of whether Clara belonged, she did, in every way that mattered. Later that afternoon, the three of them were gathered in the kitchen. Alina stood at the counter beside Clara, focused intently as Clara walked her through the steps of the recipe. Marco sat nearby, watching them with a quiet smile, feeling the peace that had settled into their home over the past 2 years. As the sauce simmered and the pasta boiled, Alina glanced up at Clara, her expression thoughtful. "Clara." Clara responded, stirring the sauce. I just want you to know that I'm glad you're here. I know I wasn't always nice to you in the beginning. But now I get it. I understand why Dad loves you, and I'm glad you're part of our family." Clara froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sincerity in Alina's voice. She turned to face her, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you, Alina," she said softly. "That means the world to me." Marco felt his throat tighten as he listened. This was the moment he had hoped for, the moment he had known would come with time, but it still took him by surprise how deeply it affected him. After dinner that evening, they sat by the fire, the house warm and filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon. Alina was nestled between Marco and Clara, the soft glow of the Christmas lights reflecting in her eyes. She seemed more at ease than ever before, her laughter ringing out freely as they told stories and reminisced about past holidays. "Remember that first Christmas we spent together?" Marco asked with a teasing smile, looking at Alina. Alina giggled. "Yeah, I was kind of a brat, wasn't I?" "You were figuring things out," Marco said gently. "And look at us now." Clara smiled, her hand resting on Marco's knee. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," Alina agreed, her voice quiet but full of contentment. As the night wore on, Alina eventually fell asleep, curled up between them, her head resting against Clara's shoulder. Marco and Clara exchanged a glance, their hearts full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. For 2 years, they had navigated the complexities of blending their lives, learning to embrace the new while honoring the past. And now, as they sat together by the fire, the warmth of family surrounding them, they knew that they had found something lasting, something beautiful. The road had been difficult, but in the end, they had created a home filled with love and acceptance, a home where they all belonged. Thanks for watching. How would you rate this story? Give it 1 to 5 stars in the comments and let me know what you thought. This is a brand new channel, and your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your likes, comments, and shares help this community grow, and I'd be so grateful to have you along for the journey. See you next time.